You're right that historically some of the state schools are maybe some of the worst. I mean, some that come to mind for me right away would be like maybe the University of Michigan or Berkeley, right, as being responsible for a lot of the the bad ideas that have since washed over the rest of higher ed. Now it does seem like a lot of the elite colleges, are in a lot of trouble if we're talking about things like free speech or intellectual diversity and that sort of thing. Princeton, Harvard, Yale.
Hey, Culminators, I would like to introduce you to Stephen McGuire today. And I'm going to share with you his page at ACTA, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. This is a higher education reform group doing really important work. And Steve has become a really good follow on X. He is the Paul and Karen Levy Fellow in Campus Freedom. He does all the things you'd expect him to do, podcasts, speaking on free speech, academic freedom. It is a very busy time for this activity. And he's got an interesting academic background in political, looks like to me like it's political science. He'll clarify me if I'm wrong. He is our first guest to have graduated from the University of Lethbridge. He is a Canadian, okay, but sometimes we can learn from our Canadian friends. And I seriously, Steve, really good to meet you. I started, like I said, seeing your stuff on X and saying, this guy is all over it. It is unreal what's going on now.
It is unreal, and thanks for having me on, Ron. And yes, I do come from Canada, but I'm also happily a naturalized American citizen, and
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so I live in the States and plan to spend the rest of my life here. But yeah, I mean, I got into working with ACTA because of concerns, that I had about the direction of higher ed, having to do with things like free expression on campus, but also, higher ed spending, those sorts of things that ACTA also works on. But then, even for those of us who follow higher ed on a regular basis and are sort of working on reform and aware of all of the problems, the last year has been unlike anything that I've ever seen. Just in terms of the disruptions on campus and the shocking revelations of what people, large numbers of people apparently think on college campuses, et cetera.
So I want to talk about that, but first I want to get a little sense of your background and how you come to this. You pursued a fairly conventional academic path, the bachelor's, the master's, the PhD. Am I guessing right from the work? Is it political science?
That's right. Yeah, my background's in political theory specifically. So, basically history of political philosophy, history of political thought, that sort of thing.
So, and when did you join ACTA?
So I've been with ACTA a little over 2 years. Before that, I was a professor at Villanova University, which is just outside of Philadelphia, Catholic
Sure.
liberal arts university. Most people know that they're great at basketball.
Right.
Won a few tournaments recently. Before that, I taught at a smaller college down the road. That's where I got my first job when I got out of grad school. And so, I've always had concerns about things like political imbalance in the academy and lack of free expression and expectations that, people sort of agree with various positions and that sort of thing. And, Villanova in lots of ways was a great place to work. I got friends and colleagues there, but we did have issues as well. In addition to teaching there, I ran a center called the Matthew J. Ryan Center, kind of an American political thought, free speech, bringing heterodox thinkers to campus kind of deal. And the first year I joined Villanova, that was the 2016-2017 academic year, the group had decided to bring Charles Murray to campus, and he was scheduled to come, I think it was end of February, early March, something like that. And, so we had that planned. I guess he'd been to Villanova a couple of years beforehand to talk about his previous book, Coming Apart. And then there was no issues at all. That was before I was there. I didn't go. But all reports were, people didn't even notice other than those who attended. But when he was coming this time this would have been in the spring of 2017. This, of course, was after Donald Trump was elected and inaugurated. And then Charles Murray had that now somewhat infamous incident at Middlebury College, where the students protested and they were actually forced to move from one building to another. And Allison Stanger, the professor at Middlebury, who was going to be interviewing him on the stage, I think someone grabbed her by the head or by the hair and yanked it, and she ended up in the hospital in a neck brace. I mean, it was just an outrageous incident. And Charles Murray was scheduled to be at Villanova, I think, about 4 or 5 weeks after that. So we ended up having a pretty significant protest and disruption of our event. There was extra police on campus, canine units, police on motorbikes, because there was a professor at Drexel University, which is, of course, in Philadelphia, had a decent following on Twitter, as it was then called. And he had, said to all of his followers that they should go down to Villanova and try to, I forget exactly what he said, but the essence of it was try to stop Charles Murray from speaking. So that, sort of kicked in all the extra police and that sort of thing. Some members of our philosophy department protested the event. They went up and stood at the front, and initially they were silent, but holding banners. I mean, the whole thing was ridiculous. And the event did go on, and the university at one point suggested that we'd have to pay some extra security bills, and we wrote up a kind of memo explaining why this would be a terrible idea, and they ended up backing off that. So, it was not an easy time. It was not a great experience. So, that was one of my first sort of major experiences with this kind of shutdown activity that we see too often on college campuses. But then I would say, just in general, from about that time on, there was just a noticeable increase in intolerance on campus. And there were things that you just knew, you couldn't say in, quote unquote, good company, basic political positions and that sort of thing. And I started to notice that, increasingly, even among the students, they would either just shut down. They didn't want to talk about it at all because they themselves feared having an open conversation about some things. And then there were some who were also increasingly in the mode of, they would want to report people who said things that they didn't like. And, this became increasingly problematic, not for me personally per se, but just, on campus in general. And so when I had a chance to work on free expression and intellectual diversity issues, not just at Villanova as one campus, but to work on this as a national issue by joining ACTA, I decided to take the plunge and, give up the academic life and, go into, a higher ed reform path.
What switch flipped? What was it? The Trump election? Was that what sort of opened up the floodgates?
So I think there were things developing, already, under the previous, the Obama administration. Of course, there were things like the Dear Colleague letter, right? Title IX type stuff, where, starting to, at a place like Villanova in particular, this is a Catholic university. So obviously Catholics obviously have a wide variety of views, but there's a lot of Catholics, who are going to say that church teaching is XYZ on things like gender and sexuality, and they're going to want to follow those things. And then on the other hand, you have these legal pressures coming from the federal government to, have, treat things around pronouns and that sort of thing as, as harassment or discrimination and that sort of thing. So I think we were already seeing sort of this rising tide of, the new kind of political correctness. Wokeness is the term that most people use for it. But yes, when Trump, after Trump was elected, I think that, regardless of what anybody thinks of Trump or that election, or anything like that, in terms of the impact on campus, right, it just immediately, in my experience, had a chilling effect in a lot of discussions. And that was coupled too with things like university administrators, high-ranking university administrators sending out statements, basically expressing on behalf of the whole community how we felt about this election, and telling us even at one point that we should be talking about this election result in our classes. And I remember hearing, now I'm a political theorist, that's not necessarily a thing that I wouldn't have done anyways if it fit into the subject matter. If we're talking about Plato one day and it comes up, like, it might be a great contemporary example to illustrate the ideas we're talking about in the text. But I heard stories about math instructors who were basically crying throughout their entire what was supposed to be a math lecture, talking about the political results of the election the night before. And you get students sort of complaining, I just want to learn math in my math class, or what have you. But then there was just a sort of overall after that. And then, of course, COVID and the murder of George Floyd and everything that happened that spring and summer, that had a massive impact as well in terms of a really pronounced increase in sort of pressure to engage in DEI activities, anti-racism activities. And again, I have my thoughts on some of these things, but just from a general higher ed standpoint, the immense pressure to get on board with doing these sorts of things and thinking about them in certain sorts of ways, I think was really problematic, right? I mean, a lot of people can have concerns about racial issues, in the United States or in the world, and there's all different ways to think about those things and to do research on them, et cetera, et cetera.
What's wrong with these people? Okay, I mean, one thing that was great to hear was that, what you just said was, students are telling you, I don't know if it's majority of students, if they're representative, but students are saying, we just want to go to class and learn math.
Yeah.
What is it? What is the mass insanity that has occurred in faculties that there's just been this? I mean, when the people who are teaching math were in college themselves, their professors weren't acting out like this.
Mm-hmm.
What changed?
It's a great question, and there's obviously a variety of competing theories, and I think historians, social scientists, others are going to continue to study this for some time and offer rival explanations. One thing I would say too is, even if we talk about a phenomenon and label it wokeness, I think we need to recognize that that's then a catch-all for all kinds of different things that are going on in all different kinds of people, right? And so I think for some people, maybe they're already heavily invested in some of these social and political causes, and they were maybe outraged by some of the things that they saw, and then they saw that other people were too, and there was an opportunity there to kind of move the football down the field, in the direction that they wanted to go. I think there were other people who, is more of a, I think people, there's a part of every person where they want to feel like they're a good person, they're doing the right kind of thing. You can think of this in terms of ethics or even spirituality. And I think we saw some of that certainly with some of the things that happened in the summer of 2020, where people were kneeling in parking lots with their masks on, and this sort of thing. So, I wouldn't reduce it to necessarily one explanation. I think there was a bunch of things going on. I think you have to add into the fact that people were already probably riddled with anxiety over the pandemic. People were stuck at home, right? Like, all of these factors fed into this.
But let me then sharpen the question a little bit. I understand all the pressure points and all the political inflammation, but how was it that faculty members decided to be so demonstrative and so, like, again, this example of let's talk about the election in classes where there is no topical reason to do so? I mean, of course, that was guidance that you're saying was coming down from administrators. to
People would
faculty.
have done it anyways, I'm sure. But yes, in my case, there was actually guidance to do that. But, I think for some people, the politics and the issues involved in something like a presidential election, they just view them as so critical to their existence that they're literally personally devastated by the election result. And when you go into class the next day, and you recall that in that election, at first I believe it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win, which is what everyone expected to happen. And by the end of the night, you could see things starting to turn. And, I remember staying up quite late and still not being quite sure what was going to happen. And, so people woke up the next day and they learned that Donald Trump, who, a lot of people obviously just absolutely hated and did not want to win the election, and a lot of college professors would fit into that category. They just woke up to what for them was devastating news. And then maybe 2 hours later, you're in your math class and, you just can't even think straight. Maybe you get this message from the administration saying that you should talk about it, not only that you're free to, but that you should. And also, they college campuses, a lot of them are political bubbles. So you're not ever really confronted with people who have extremely serious political disagreements or different points of view. And so there is, and this was quite evident after 2016, that there's this tendency to assume that everyone in the room more or less agrees. And the same thing applied to the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Is it was just assumed that most people would more or less agree with this, and this is the right thing to do. And it's really just a question of how we're going to do this, not a question of what approach we're, whether we're going to do it or whether everybody has to do it. And, and a lot of that bureaucratic apparatus was already built into the universities by that time too. So once there was an opening to sort of push this stuff, a lot more, they of course took that opening. And, that was certainly, some of my experience.
So much of what we said is already familiar to anyone who would be listening to this. Higher education seems to be a train wreck. First, a very basic question. Are people learning anything anymore?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think people still are. I think that, there's a way at a lot of places to sort of wind your way through the institution and get a great education. Certainly, I think if you're taking programs in STEM or, STEM related fields, engineering, nursing, there's obviously a lot of great programs where people are coming out and they're, quite able to do these professions. There's obviously some concerns these days that certain kinds of considerations are working their way into these programs as well that, aren't based on, things like merit and excellence and that sort of thing. As far as the humanities and the social sciences go, I think that's a little bit different. And I do think that it's valuable to think about different parts of the university. I mean, I myself, especially on Twitter, when you've only got a short number of characters, I'll treat the whole thing as sort of, this university said this or did this, that sort of thing. But I do think we have to look at the various parts of the university and ask ourselves, which parts of these are still making productive contributions to society, are offering students a solid education, which schools, which programs. But I think that there are, some certainly in the humanities and the social sciences where, it's highly questionable what the value is that students are getting out of it, unless they come in super knowledgeable and are able to sort of make their way through in terms of which courses should they take, which professors are there to work with. But, in my experience, that's very few people.
And college administrators what incentive do they have to take that kind of harsh look? They have none, because who wants to reduce the size of a program or eliminate a program? That means less appointment power and less a smaller kingdom. Nobody ever reduces his kingdom. So I mean, ACTA is trustees, right? American
Yes, trustees and alumni. Yeah.
trustees, alumni. We're all alumni, so I'm not quite sure what that means. I guess that's an allusion to donors.
In part, yes, but there's also groups like the Academic Freedom Alliance, or sorry, the Academic Freedom Alliance is a great organization, but
That's
there's
Robert
also
George, right?
the alumni free speech groups. Yeah, that's right, and Keith Whittington. But there's all and others. But there's a series of alumni groups that have cropped up at various universities, and they all operate under one umbrella. And these are alumni who have organized to try and lobby their institutions to improve their record, especially on issues of free expression.
I didn't know that because I'm a member of Princetonians for Free Speech.
Okay, yeah, so that would be an example, yeah.
And does Princetonians for Free Speech operate under that umbrella also?
That's right. And uh, they may be the first or one of the first such groups. A really big one is the MIT Free Speech Alliance, but there's got to be over 20, 30 of these chapters now, or I guess they're all independent organizations and then sort of housed under the one larger organization.
Not even 10 years ago, I remember observing that, and I might have even discussed this with Robert George, which was not 10 years ago, it was maybe 3 years ago when I had him on. No, I don't think I would have said this to him. But Princeton and the upper tier schools seemed to be hanging in there in terms of academic freedom, free speech on campus, not having turned that corner. But what my observation was that the state universities were already radioactive.
Hmm.
And because some of them did, but not necessarily all of them, probably not most of them, not have a tradition of excellence in scholarship. And they were also attached to public money.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't have quite the same responsiveness to alumni and donor concerns. And it seemed to me that, that was going to be a divide, but that divide doesn't exist at all anymore. All the private universities, with some very notable exceptions. I mean, even the University of Chicago, right, which was supposed to be the bastion, the Chicago principles, has really folded in the last, few months. Didn't they end up dropping? They ended up giving degrees to everyone who they had withheld degrees from for that outrageous, uh, you know, pro pro-Palestinian. It's really pro-Hamas demonstration that they did at graduation.
Yeah, as far as I know, that's correct.
I mean, is this just a complete downhill slide? Is there? I mean, obviously, you go to work every day in the end because you believe that there's a way to save the situation. So what's the plan? What's the path?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I think relative to a number of other universities, University of Chicago didn't do the worst job. Still would have liked to see them take a stronger stance. They do still do a fairly good job of adhering to the Chicago principles and their ideal of institutional neutrality, and I think they should be commended for that. You're right that historically some of the state schools are maybe some of the worst. I mean, some that come to mind for me right away would be like maybe the University of Michigan or Berkeley, right, as being responsible for a lot of the bad ideas that have since washed over the rest of higher ed. Now it does seem like a lot of the elite colleges, are in a lot of trouble if we're talking about things like free speech or intellectual diversity and that sort of thing. Princeton, Harvard, Yale, there's plenty of stories about people who have been either canceled at those institutions or shouted down, or there's just, really
Or they
bizarre.
find some stale old, sexual harassment complaint that was resolved. I mean, this is again alluding to
Exactly.
Princeton and Robert George, Robert George's colleague and client.
Yeah.
All right, so these you've agreed with me about the problems. What's other than writing about it and shouting about it, by being an actor, you're not there, you're not inside anymore. Of course, if you were, they'd squash you like a bug.
Yeah,
What's the plan?
probably
What's the
not.
plan?
Probably won't be going back inside anytime soon. But yeah, so part of my job obviously is public in terms of writing about things, covering things on X, that sort of thing. But a lot of the work that we do is, not that sort of thing, is not necessarily out in the public like that. So let me just say quickly, ACTA has three areas of focus, three things that we advocate for. The first is academic excellence. And one of our main projects in under that category is our website, What Will They Learn? And that's a website where we track the core curricula at well over 1,000 universities around the country, and we give them a rating based on whether they require their students to take American history or government, literature, economics, these sorts of things. And so we're strong advocates for a robust, fairly traditional liberal arts core. And, very few schools that we look at score well on that. I think maybe the last I heard is, in the A range was about 13 across the nation. And those tend to be not exclusively, but they tend to be, private religious colleges and that sort of thing who have a strong tradition of classical education. But a lot of schools just are not requiring students to take a robust core. And this is something that, can be paired with just about any major. Sometimes there's a little bit of pressure when it comes to, say, an engineering program because they have so many credits that are required for those majors in order for the program to be accredited and that sort of thing. But yeah, you can see there, lots of C's, more than a few
Amherst,
B's and
F.
F's. That's
I
right.
mean,
Yeah. Well,
Amherst is
and
pretty notorious, I'll grant you. But
yeah. Yeah, so that's one thing that we do. Another thing that we do is accountability. And so we have a project called How Colleges Spend Money that takes data from IPEDS, the federal database, and provides this to people in a more easily accessible and readable form. And it shows you the spending at colleges and universities around the country. And we track things like the ratio of spending on administration to the ratio of spending on instruction, various other things, and you can sort of trace it over time. And so you see the chart there, and you can go in and you can look up, say, your school or your alma mater, and you could compare it to other schools. And there are, suggested sort of benchmark schools that you can compare it to and that sort of thing. And so you can see, relative to other universities that are in maybe the same general range of the one that you're looking at, how does your school fare? So you can, and, of course, one of the things that we're advocating when we put this project out is, to reduce spending on unnecessary things, right? Reduce bureaucratic spending, that sort of thing. And then the third thing, and this is the part that I work on primarily, is academic freedom. And the centerpiece of our work on academic freedom is our Campus Freedom Initiative. And this is grounded in what we call our ACTA Gold Standard for Freedom of Expression. The ACTA Gold Standard is basically a 20-point plan, or a set of 20 policies and practices that colleges and universities can adopt that we think will help to promote a culture of free expression and intellectual diversity on their campus. And this includes things like adopting the Chicago principles. The one that we're seeing some movement on, especially right now, is adopting the University of Chicago's Calvin Report, or the policy of institutional neutrality. And this is, for us, this involves both that the university will not make official statements on contemporary political and social controversies, and we include within that it will not engage in political divestment. So for a school to get full credit from ACTA for a position of institutional neutrality, that has to include a commitment to not divesting, say, from Israel, which is obviously the main one that's being pushed for right now. So, but like I said, there's 20 things, right? And so we want to see student groups on campus that are promoting the free exchange of ideas. We want to see debates on campus. We want to see bias response teams removed. We want to see campuses ensuring that students, faculty, and staff all have available to them clear rules and rights and expectations regarding things like free expression, as well as, legitimate restrictions on that, like time, place, and manner restrictions. What are the consequences? If you disrupt a speaker, it should be clear that that's a violation of the rules, and there should be a clear sense of what the consequences should be. And of course, obviously the most difficult part for most colleges, universities, is to actually enforce these rules. It's one thing to have them on on the website or in some musty old book somewhere. It's another thing to actually say, look, you violated this rule. Here's the process you have to go through, and we're going to stick to it.
Before we even get to that, though, why is anyone listening to you? What are your pressure points? What is it that, because you and I can sit here and agree that, we've got, and we can even invite Robert Georgian and all the other people working in this space. It seems like you've got some things that you can actually point to as achievements. How? Why? Why do they care what ACTA says?
At almost any institution, there's people who want to see change, who want to see reform, whether it's their alma mater or the institution where they currently work or study. There are heterodox voices, and these are people with a range of different political views and academic interests. Think about another organization such as Heterodox Academy. I'm not sure what their membership is up to now, but this is essentially a faculty membership group, and it's growing and quite strongly. And that's a good sign, right? That there's people who want a freer, more open campus or experience on campus. Students, of course, will often push for this. As our name suggests, now ACTA will work with just about anybody who wants to see reform in higher ed or at their particular university. But we, our bread and butter is working with trustees and offering trustees, a sort of, whatever they need. If it's education about the role of the trustee, that's one of the things we do, right? You think about trustees, and sometimes trustees are selected. It's kind of it's an honor to be selected as a trustee for a lot of people of your alma mater. Maybe you're successful in business or something else, and you can come in, maybe make some donations, maybe bring in some donations, and then you go to campus 3, maybe 4 times a year, and you get to go to a basketball game or a football game in the president's box, maybe a couple of nice meals, maybe see some contacts or old friends, that sort of thing. And they dump a stack of papers on your desk, maybe that day or a week or 2 weeks before, and ask you to rubber stamp all of it. But trustees bear fiduciary responsibility for these institutions and for the ongoing sort of mission of the university and sort of the mission of the university in the long run.
But isn't I'm sorry, but isn't the problem with trustees that boards of trustees get captured the way corporate boards do? Basically, the to become a trustee, you're filtered. Yeah, there's some kind of alumni voting, but you're filtered through the administration in the first place. So they're going to tend to be people. I mean, look what happened to Amy Wax. There were there was a trustee there. I don't remember his name, who was pounding the table and saying, this is outrageous, this has got to stop. And they said, we don't really need you or your money anymore. There's plenty of people, we've got.
Well, so that trustee, Paul Levy.
Paul Levy, who is
he supports my position.
Right.
At ACTA. Yeah.
I should talk to Paul Levy too.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, different boards are selected in different ways, right? Sometimes they're politically appointed, especially if it's a public university, obviously. Some of them are self-perpetuating. They sort of select their own members over time, that sort of thing. And so, yeah, some of the boards, it's probably difficult to get much traction with them unless maybe sometimes somebody sneaks in. An interesting case right now is at Harvard, that I'll be watching in the years to come, because I don't know if you saw this or recall, but last year Bill Ackman was supporting some candidates who were trying to run to get on, and they had difficulties, arguably difficulties that were caused, by Harvard, whether intentionally or unintentionally. They had difficulties even getting the requisite number of signatures that they could then be put on the ballot, for the election. But I think last I heard, they're planning to try again, for the next election. And they obviously have learned from what happened last time. And I think they'll come in with a better strategy. And, so that'll be interesting to see if some reform-minded trustees are able to get themselves elected to the Harvard board. Now, of course, at Harvard, you have the larger group that they would be elected to, and then you have the smaller group, the corporation that does a lot of the actual decision-making and governing. But nevertheless, that is an interesting step towards getting some reform-minded candidates. But yeah, you look at other places, sometimes it only takes one person too. I mean, a lot of trustees, they may not be against having a free expression resolution or statement on the books, but they never thought about it, or they're not the ones who are going to put it forward. But if one person gets on the board and sort of learns about the Chicago principles, or learns about the ACTA Gold Standard, which includes the Chicago principles, or a like-minded statement, and they say, yeah, hey, we should do this. And maybe they reach out to ACTA and say, how do we do this? What do you recommend? And we can obviously provide any literature or assistance. And I've seen instances where that one person brings this to their board, and it just gets done. And it's not that big of a problem because people aren't at that level aren't necessarily fundamentally against it. Now, that's just one step, right? Adopting the Chicago principles is an important thing to do. It sets the tone from the top down, or at least it can. But of course, then you actually need to adhere to it, and you need to develop other policies that are consistent with it, all the way down. But yeah, so we sometimes have individual board members who reach out to us. Sometimes we'll send out mailings, and we'll make new friends. There's all kinds of different ways that we can do it. But a really effective reform-minded board is one that maybe has 3 or 4 people on it who understand things like, they're willing to dig into the curricular issues, they're willing to dig into the financial issues, and they're willing to dig into the academic freedom and free speech issues on campus. And, then they can, recommend some changes, and that carries some weight if there's a group of them.
I have a little bit of a pet theory, but when I was my wife, Jane Coleman, who writes for Legal Insurrection, had interviewed Amy Wax and really got to know about the whole situation there, and learned about the Paul Levy. And we were wondering, well, what changed? And one of the things I think that must have changed is that universities have become so freaking wealthy that there are very few. I mean, even Bill Ackman can't get his way at Harvard. Of course, he already gave the money. But technology, licensing, and endowment, portfolio management, and Wall Street have made the top schools so wealthy that they really don't have to answer to hardly anyone anymore.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then you couple that with a view that these institutions should be utterly autonomous in their self-governance, or their, you run into these problems. So they're both sort of ideologically inclined to want to protect their ability to govern themselves. And then in addition, what you're saying, certainly for like the Ivies and a lot of elite colleges, this is correct. It's obviously a bit of a different story at a lot of the public schools. And of course, a lot of colleges and universities are what we call tuition driven, and they really do sort of live paycheck to paycheck year over year, more or less, or at least if they had a series of down years, that could become, really bad for them. And, I think I think a lot of those colleges in particular, they have an opportunity to advertise themselves as places that have embraced free expression and embraced intellectual diversity, and that they actually offer that. And I think there's people out there, who want that. And of course, there's always going to be the pressure of the prestige and the quality and everything that comes with going to an elite institution. But I think there are people who would say, I'll go to maybe a place that's a little bit more local, a little less expensive, but has a commitment to freedom of expression and intellectual diversity. But yeah, in terms of these, these elite colleges, I think you're right, and that makes them a particularly hard nut to crack. Obviously, there's people out there now who are talking about things like, should the endowments be taxed? They're receiving federal grant monies. Should there be expectations for freedom of expression, more robustly attached to things like that? Even things like student loan monies and all of those sorts of things. And I think that there's also a need to think about the universities as being part of a social contract. And Americans need to ask themselves, what are we getting out of this deal? Why are these institutions tax exempt? And what do we expect from them? And, I do think, we have to be cognizant of the fact that a lot of these elite institutions do still produce an enormous amount of technology and innovation, and they make all kinds of contributions that we don't want to lose. If anything, we want them to get better, in those respects. But then when you look at some of the things like the political bias on campus, the lack of free expression for certain views, well, one of the things these colleges should be doing in terms of their teaching function is preparing students for citizenship, right? And if they're not exposing the students to a wide variety of views that are present in American society, if they're not giving them a robust education in our system of government and our political history, and one that isn't completely skewed towards pointing out all the terrible things that have happened in the course of American history, then there's an argument to be made that they're not really living up to their end of the bargain, even if they are elite private institutions that aren't, directly receiving, say public monies in the way that, say, a state flagship would or something like that. And, certainly I think it's important to recognize that, as a matter of, say, faculty expertise, faculty should have a high degree of self-government over certain aspects of the university, but also if they sort of go off the rails, there needs to be checks on that, and trustees can certainly be a check on that. And so ACT, of course, advocates for that when necessary. But, in some of these cases where even the trustees don't want to seem to enact some basic reforms that really anybody who cares about higher ed should want, then you have to start asking some of these broader questions about cultural shifts, possibly legislative interventions. But, of course, the ideal would be for these universities to live up to, like I said, their end of the bargain and, provide what these institutions should be providing to the society as a whole.
Is there any kind of consensus on the question? I guess I'm prejudiced. I mean, look, you talked about three categories of economic situations. And I think it's really important to first make this clear. You do have the ability, we do, people who care, certainly people like you who do it for a living, if you have the tuition sensitive institutions, you can either present them with incentives, or you can also, by publicizing what's going on, and that there have been a number of colleges that have closed down. People have stopped going, and at least one public one as well, because they've been so trashed by the complete anarchy, academic and otherwise, on these campuses. So you can affect them, and you can, certainly the public ones you can affect by going to legislatures. Now, of course, in some states, the legislatures are every bit as loony as what's going on the campuses, but at least you do have pressure points there. The problem with the elite institutions, obviously, is that, again, they have wealth, they have a lot of, they have outsized influence. You must wrestle with the question, and especially given your background in political philosophy, who is the institution? What is the constituency of the faculty thinks it's the institution? The trustees, whom are the trustees fiduciaries to? Is it the Harvard Corporation? Because that's, where does that get us?
Mm-hmm. Well, their responsibilities to the institution and its health and its productivity and its greatness over time. They're the ones who are responsible for overseeing that and ensuring that the university continues to be excellent, possibly to grow, that sort of thing. I mean, in a way, the core of the university is the faculty and the students. Right now, of course, modern universities have all kinds of functions, right? Some of them have hospitals, they have sports teams, people use the facilities, they provide jobs to the towns that they're in. Like there's all kinds of layers in terms of what universities do and provide these days. Some of them are basically, membership only spas, in terms of the resources, all these sorts of things. But, traditionally the core is there's people who want to be educated and there's people who have the expertise, to give them the education. And then, different universities have been set up and chartered in different ways historically. In the United States, obviously, we have this robust tradition of states creating their own public institutions, and they all have charters, right? They have constitutions and bylaws that explain why they were set up and what they were for. And, trustees should look at those documents and they should say like, well, what was the the vision maybe evolves over time somewhat and that sort of thing, but, look at the vision for the institution, look at the mission of the institution. That's where the fidelity should be. And so if a institution today has veered off course from what it's supposed to be doing and what it's supposed to be, then that might be an opportunity where trustees certainly need to ask some questions and should feel entitled to do so. And possibly start talking about instituting some reforms as necessary. It's always better to have buy-in from the whole community. It's always better for the institutions to reform themselves, at least in my view. But if you get to a point where somebody has to step up because not everybody's not doing what the institution was set up for, then maybe somebody has to take more drastic or more unilateral action.
Given the acute nature of what happened over the last year, do you think, is there any respect in which that presents an opportunity as opposed to merely just, reason to be pessimistic?
I hate to think about it that way because obviously what happened over the last year was so horrible. But on the other hand, I think more people have become aware of the problems and how drastic the problems are, or how deep the problems run because of what's happened in the last year. And I think we have seen a lot more attention paid to higher ed in general, and there's a lot more desire for reform. And so I think there is a bit of an opportunity, if you want to call it that, because people have been outraged by what they've seen. And so they are, asking, what can we do about this? And, I think we've seen that actually quite a bit over the last several years, like these alumni groups that I was mentioning that have formed, right? These are all relatively new organizations that have formed because they see that things aren't going in the right direction. And I think we're seeing even more of that now. The one thing that I would point to is institutional neutrality. I've been documenting this on X, and we documented on our
Yes.
website, which I posted.
Very exciting. Yeah, I've retweeted that. That's been a really surprising positive development that's sold it all.
Yeah, and I think people are reasonably skeptical to some degree that this is maybe just a PR move, or that it is a chance to sort of hide what's going on these campuses by not just sort of overtly stating it all the time. But I do think that for most colleges and universities, institutional neutrality is the right policy. Now you maybe make some exceptions for certain kinds of private colleges, religious colleges, for instance, that on certain issues they might say, look, on this campus, this isn't really necessarily up for debate. But in those cases, I think advertising that truly, truth in advertising is the way to go. Like, tell people before they get there, look, you have all the freedom in the world to discuss 95% of things just like you would at any other university, but there's a few things here that we don't really question because our students are coming here because we believe in these things or what have you. But as far as generally speaking, I think this is the right policy. I'm glad to see the movement. I think that it's not just a superficial PR move. I think people are seeing that there's a value to this. One of the things about the response to Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, and just the absolute debacle of universities trying to respond to this. And it really was just so horrible and dismaying. But I think one of the things that they experienced in this case that they have not experienced on some other issues is that there was actually large groups of people on either side of the issue that were pressuring them to make different kinds of statements. And I'm sure they've experienced some of that before, but in this case, no matter what a university president said, there was going to be a faction of people who were going to be upset about this. And to some degree, not entirely, because both groups are present both off campus and on campus. But on the one hand, I think there were some very vocal factions on the campus that they would have to face if they were to make a statement that was too pro-Israel. And then on the other hand, if they came out with a statement that didn't recognize the horror of October 7th for what it was, or tried to somehow both sides it, that they would hear from, alumni and donors and legislators, as it turned out. We've seen a lot of legislative involvement, especially at the federal level, as you know, over the last year. So, I think they had that experience, and maybe that did kind of drive home for them the experience of, oh, yeah, you can have disagreement on a campus, and maybe there's something to be said for not just trying to decide the issue on behalf of everybody.
Maybe we can teach math.
Yeah, that's right. And let people have political discussions in the dining hall. Now, obviously, some of the things that are going on campuses are just outrageous. So that certainly has to be taken into consideration. One other thing I'd add with institutional neutrality is similar to what I said earlier about the Chicago principles, which is that these are good things to do, but they're not sufficient. And, for ACTA, like I said, we have this 20-point plan, the gold standard. So these are only 2 of the 20 things. And so if all these colleges and universities do is adopt a position of institutional neutrality, but in no way sort of go through a process of reflection and seek to reform themselves in terms of what's going on their campuses, then I think those who are skeptical will be vindicated. And they will see that, no, they just identified this as a policy that would allow them to, get some cover and sort of carry on doing what they're doing. I think institutional neutrality needs to be part of a real and substantive reform process that includes a bunch of these other points. And I would add, too, that, adopting these policies and practices is just part of it. Ultimately, what you want is a college campus that embraces free expression and embraces viewpoint and intellectual diversity and sees these as good things that contribute to the activities of the college or the university. And so, setting these policies in place, I think, can have or start to have that impact. But ultimately, what we really want to see are the people on campus, embracing and valuing these things, rather than trying to avoid them, which is often the case, right? Because they're chasing out people that they disagree with. They're not hiring people who don't study the things that they want to be studied, all of these things. So it becomes a kind of biased, siloed monoculture.
Believe it or not, we've been talking for an hour.
All right.
And I mean, given all this news, there's no end to it, obviously. Are you up for the fight?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're in it for the long haul. I think we're seeing successes all the time. And yes, you're right. It's bad. On a lot of days, it looks irredeemable. But there's a lot of people who recognize the value of a true education. There's other organizations, obviously, in addition to ACTA, who are pushing for these things. We see trustees stepping up. We see alumni stepping up. There's faculty who are fighting back, which is always an extremely courageous thing to do. There's students who are standing up, and we are seeing reforms. So I don't think we should be Pollyannish about this. I think it's going to take a long time, but I think there is an appetite for reform, and certainly at ACTA, we've been doing ACTA itself has been doing this since the mid-90s. So our 30th anniversary is coming up, I believe, next year. It'll only be my 3rd at ACTA, but the 30th, for ACTA. And I think we've had a lot of positive impact, going back, looking at what ACT has done over the years. There's a lot of positive impact. And in the short time that I've been here, there's been a lot of things, that have happened that have been good for higher ed reform. And you don't necessarily always see those things, in the headlines, and that sort of thing. I try to promote not just the bad stories sometimes on X, but also some of the good stories, like these institutional neutrality
Yeah.
developments. And they don't always get as many likes, as the crazy negative stories, which is okay. People get fired up, and I'm all for that too. But there is good stuff, and it's not all on the surface either.
Steve, thanks for talking.
Thanks for having me. This has been great.
I'm glad I was able to acquaint myself more with what you guys are doing and to hopefully spread the news. You give me a little bit of hope after all. I mean, my wife and I are both like this. We were those kids who looked forward to the first day of school. We're school kids.
Yeah.
And my time in college, in many respects, were the best days of my life. And it is so disheartening to see what's going on campuses now. Keep up the good work, and thanks again for coming out to the show.
Yeah. Thanks, Ron. It's been great.